Hello to everybody. Today we're going to work on painting a rose, a couple of roses. The sketch work has been done. Let me see if I zoom in closer. Perhaps you can see it. It's a little hard to see some of the lines. You know, we tried to make the lines very delicate when doing watercolor, because lines don't really, they tend not to disappear under the paint, and so I prefer to minimize having any dark lines. The painting process is fairly straightforward for a flower like this. I like to take a little bit of soft, transparent yellow and put it in a few areas, even though this is a pink rose, and the highlights will tend to be mostly white in the bright sun. I like to put in some of the very bright petals that are in sun. I like to put some very soft yellow. Just because I like, even though it's a pink rose, I like the warmth that it adds. So I'm using a little bit of, I could just leave some areas white, and I may leave some edges white, but I'm going to put in some of those areas of the flower that are in the sun. And in this case, the sun is coming from above and a little bit on the left. So I always I generally work from multiple photographs. I try to find photographs that, to me, really speak to me about the form of the flower, or whether, even if it's a horse, I use multiple photographs to make compositions of horses racing together or running together, or standing in a river eating together. To me, I enjoy making the composition from photos that I've taken from different flowers. I've been lucky to work in some places where roses grow very, very well, and there are some really beautiful rose gardens, and I've been able to take a lot of photos of roses. Even though I have roses in my garden, I can't say that they're beautiful like this. They're kind of simple roses, and they're not prolific in terms of making big, beautiful blooms. When I'm traveling for my work, which is sanitation, I've been working on sanitation in developing countries for many years. When I'm traveling for my work, I often will buy roses and have them in my room and do still lifes from those. I might show them as a still life in a vase, but oftentimes I just like to do close-up photos like this. And then paint them as individual flowers. So I'm just putting a little bit of warm yellow. And there's going to be, it's not going to affect very much the color of these pink roses, but it just adds something a little bit interesting to the composition. In this case, that's what my choice is. So I've put these flowers, oops, a little bit of dust. These flowers are not at all from the same, they're not next to each other in a garden, but they're individual blossoms that I've put together. We're so lucky that nowadays, even in the supermarket, when I go buy my groceries, it's so easy to pick up some roses and bring them home, which I often do, and I never go without photographing them. So I have literally hundreds and hundreds of photographs of roses. And even though it might seem complicated, to me, the rose is one of the easier flowers to draw and paint. I find some flowers, because of their unusual shape, they don't quite look real when you paint them. And so I find them very hard to paint and make them, for them to look real. Daffodils, for example, are a little complicated from my point of view to paint. And irises and orchids, because they have a structure to them that is not soft and floppy, and so it almost seems a bit plastic. So it's a little harder to make them look like they're natural. So I'm doing this initial stage, and from this point forward, the flowers will be entirely done in a variety of pinks, some violets, maybe a little bit of orange here and there, but not too, probably, maybe not. In some areas, in some shadow areas, just to make the shadows pop a little bit, not just shadows that are violet or gray, but shadows that are interesting. One more bloom, that's one more petal that's going out into the side. And I have not decided at all what the background will be. Probably there'll be some bluish greens in the background. I've got these nice green leaves here and this nice green bud there. So I think the greens might work pretty well. Okay. So which pink? So many pinks to choose from. I have permanent rose and rose d'or, which means rose outside, rose madder, quinacridone rose. So many possibilities. Which one to start with? I have opera pink also, which I really love, but it's very, very bright. I'll only use it in the most bright places. I think I'm going to start with mixing together some opera rose with a little bit of permanent rose. That will give me a central rose that is fairly bright, but very transparent. So I'll be starting with putting in different roses. And the way I do my petals is I like to work one at a time and think about it. as if it's coming out and folding around. So like here, when the petals are beginning to be in a more open way, they're a little lighter on the top, so I put in my first layer, and then I use some water to stretch that out a little bit and show some gradation in the petal. And I'll just work my way around. Here's another one. I'll continue with that mixture for a little bit here. I'm going to put it a little more dark in the inner part. And then take some, wash my brush, dampen it, wipe the excess water away, and just pull out some of that color and gradation. I'll go to another petal that's not right next to those, and do the same on this one here, because I'm going to change the pink a little bit from petal to petal. So this one I'm going to do the little part that bends around, and then I'm going to spread it out a little bit toward the edge, and then underneath that edge it'll be a darker, slightly different pink. I'll just let that dry. Go around and find another light edge where I might want it to be a little bit bright. I think this one might be nice. This glaze is very transparent, and over that soft yellow it'll create a nice, very soft, warm yellow. And I'm working with all transparent colors for these glazes. So the yellow that I put in was Aurelian yellow, which is one of the most transparent yellows, and it's very soft, warm, not too lemony, not too earthy, just a very soft, warm, clear, transparent yellow. And I put it in a very, very washy glaze. So that's a nice one. So you can see that I've made it's a little bit darker down where it's in more shadow as it comes from the center of the flower. Choose another place to do this. This petal here is quite large, and it's thin, and it's fully in the light. I think it'd be a nice one to do with this soft color. And I'll do some parts of it toward the center, a little darker, and other parts of it lighter as I go out. So let me just fill in some of this one here. And of course they all kind of open out in a little bit of a bowl shape as they open and bend toward the light. As they open, they bend. So I can just use some water to pull that color down and out. And I might even drop some additional color in as I go along while it's wet. But this is a first layer that is meant to be very delicate. Can put stronger shadows in at the end. this water and bring some of that color down, very, very light as it goes and opens. And with this one, as it goes down to the edges, they get a little darker too, because they're bending then downward. So it comes up from the stem and opens up in the light. And then as it's after it's opened on the edges, it's bending down a little bit. Every now and then there seems to be some little piece of lint, but you always grab those right away. So it's just darker by using less water in the mixture. Yeah, I like the idea that as we move down to the edge of the painting, that we don't have big empty dark light areas that seem like they're empty spaces. I mean, sometimes you want them, but I don't generally leave a place where the viewer loses the feeling of going in toward the center of the painting. So this one will have these, it'll go in, you can almost get a sense, the beginning sense of the petal changing and moving out of the sunlight. And we have to be a little careful with handling this water within the flower, because we don't want to have it so wet that it creates a bloom, unless that's deliberately planned. Okay, so that's the little graded wash inside one petal. This is one of the biggest petals, and so you want that wash to be fairly smooth and not have any distracting blooms inside of it from having areas of wet and dry that are different. Okay, so that's the beginning of that. Now I think I might do one more flower petal in that combination of opera pink and Quinacridone rose. Let's see which one it will be. I think maybe this one here. And like before, I'm going to put this here so I can reach without putting my hand on the painting. It's a little plastic stand that lets me rest my hand without making a mess of the paint. It's very good for pencil drawing too. And I take my water, I clean my brush completely, take the water off the brush and just use a damp brush. If I need a little tiny bit more, I can add it, but then basically take a small amount of water and stretch the color out, being careful how much water I add, because I want it lighter. So I'm just pulling color out of the edge and bringing it down to the edge of the paint, and bringing it down to the edge of the petal. And I can lift a little bit if I dry my brush on my paper towel like this. I can lift a little color out and make it lighter. So that's what I'm doing. A piece of lint. Okay, so I think I'll go next to a little bit of rose madder. Rose madder is also transparent, but it's has a little more of a brownish tone to it. It's a little warmer. Has some kind of either yellow or orange or something in it that's a little bit less fluorescent and pure pink. I think you'll see it when I put it down. It's hard to know how true the colors are from the camera. But I think you can see the slight difference. Now I'm not trying to make them darker, but I'm just trying to make the hue a little different from petal to petal. And I'm protecting those edges. Oh, there's another one of that piece. I can't blame any cats for these little pieces of hair because I don't have any right now. Both of my cats died last year, so I can't blame the cats. I'm not sure where these little tiny lint-like hairs are coming from. So I'll take a little bit of water here, add more water to that mix, and bring that in a little bit lighter. I added the water to the mixture on the palette. And then when I get closer to the edge, I will wash my brush in the water and just pull color down like that, like I did. Clean the brush, wipe it, and just use a little bit of water. Pull it down. So it's very, 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 very diluted. Here the petal is coming up a little bit and bending around. So I'm going to put just a little bit darker as if it's under shadow. But in these other areas, it's bending downward. Okay. So this is the way, so then now I'll take that same, slightly different pink. This is a Quinacridone. It's more like a violet, Quinacridone violet, but it's or fuchsia. And I'll use that over here on this petal here. This is just one approach. One could just glaze the entire flower in a pink and then put in shadows. That's one thing that could be done. And, you know, but I do enjoy the idea of having some slight diversity in the petal colors, which one would get depending on whether the petals are, which ones are in shadow, but they're all, each petal is kind of unique, and I like the idea of kind of honoring each petal and giving it its own little personality. You know, one could take the rose madder. That was a bit of a slightly fuchsia, and I like the idea of taking that color and bringing it into a petal that we've already done. While it's still on my palette, so you might want to bring it in a little bit of that fuchsia over here to this petal. That's where the petal is kind of just turning around and there's an edge. And then I go back to the idea of the opera rose with a little bit of permanent pink, and I'm going to add a little bit of Quinacridone red to that, and do the underside of this petal here. When I start working on the shadows, I'll probably use one violet or neutral and neutral throughout the entire flower, and that will bring some unification to the shadows. I'm continuing this process of making shadows. There are a few of the petals that were done with some yellow below, and I think there's some value to creating a shadow that has some orange tones in it. So I've mixed together some oranges with a little bit of burnt scarlet, and thought I'd give it a try on this one here. This petal is coming out, and it's a warm petal in the light. So rather than going with the rose and violet, I'm going with a little bit of burnt scarlet. Could be even a burnt sienna, a little bit, with some orange, like a sennelier orange is often very nice, and a little bit of rose to make that shadow. I'm only going to differentiate some of the petals that are with the yellow background, not all, but I think that on the flower itself I can see some of those very subtle differences in the photograph that I have of the flower. And also some of the petals were just at different points of life and slightly more transitioning in their life to fading. So some of them have a little bit of different tone. But this is a bud, and it was just opening at different places relative to the sunlight. And so it had a different cast in it. So that's, other than, I mentioned using the rose and cobalt violet mixture. I've made a slightly orange and with what's called a Quinacridone burnt scarlet. But one could try to do that with perhaps a little bit of burnt sienna with an orange. It has a slightly brown tone. And I included some of the original rose in the mixture. So, okay. So that's the process. Let's see, I can do maybe one more down here. There's one here where the petal is coming out in the light, and it has, as it's coming out, it has a shadow near its inner part, and it's rising up toward the sun where it's opening. And so I'm just going to bring this orange up in here. Sometimes it's a little bit risky to try out things like this, but I like to be adventurous with color. One can always tone down later, especially when you're doing this work in a very transparent way with thin washes of transparent colors. We can do the same thing over here. This is also opening up. It has a yellow cast, and so I'll make that mixture of the orange and the rose and the burnt scarlet. And just make that a little stronger there. I like the idea. It's a big petal, so there's room to put more depth in the central color. And just as with everything, I'm cleaning my brush and bringing a damp brush in to transition the color, so that and just a damp brush, because if it's too wet, it will make a mess. Yeah. And if any of these need to be toned down later, they can be. Put a few more colors here and there. It doesn't have to be too definitive in each case, and it can be just some colors here and there. Yeah, I like that. Just one bit of that, and I can even put that other cobalt violet mixture over some of these orange ones. It's very warm, pretty color. So it doesn't have to be either or. It can be in a few places. Put it here. I think it would be good there. Here, there. just a little bits here and there. Bring it together. It helps to pull it together. All right, so let's, oops, drop my brush. This needs a little more. Because it's fading very quickly. Yeah, okay. Put it here and there. All right, good. So that's the process that I'll continue off camera and come back to you. Take care. I just want to show you that I'm continuing this process. I'm still using rose to mix with other colors to create shadows, and so I'm keeping the rose color as a base in each of these, and I've added some kind of reddish brown. It's called burnt scarlet, but it can be made with a little bit of burnt sienna and scarlet red. And then to this cobalt mixture that we were using before, here's the cobalt, I added some Quinacridone magenta, and I continued with this orange mixture, just deepening the reds in the orange mixture so it's a little darker. I just wanted to show you the mixtures and the fact that this process is it is a slow process. I mean, there are other ways of painting the rose, but I've already put in a softer orange shadow in there. It started with a soft yellow, covered with a soft rose, then that earlier orange shadow, and now intensifying it. And I'll drop a little bit of the darker shadow that has the magenta in it in there, and that might bring it to the final stage for that petal that I might be happy with. Here I'm going to put some water in this shadow, and drop in a little more orange shadowing, because this petal is in the light. And I'm going to drop in the magenta mixture close to the center, and let these colors mix, like over here too, mix and blend. And now as the petal opens, sometimes you'll get some veins coming out of the shadow, and as it dries I might pull some of the paint into the petal to do that. I don't want to overdo that, because while this rose does have a fair amount of texture, if I do too much of it, it's going to be a distraction. So it's kind of a decision as you go along how much of those veins to show. Here I might show a few, just some. It tends to show the direction of the petal. They have to be put in pretty lightly, so you put in a little more water for those. Mix it with a little more water. Okay. Some of the petals have very, very few veins. and some have more. You can see how, sorry, I don't mean to be moving the board, but some have more than others. But they help to show the direction of the petal. And some of them that have a little wrinkly edge on the petal might have a few of those wrinkly vein marks on the edge of the petal. And this is one where I think this petal is so big and it has, it needs to have a little texture in it. So let's do one of these over here, just to make a little more emphasis here. I've already dropped in some more of the orange, and I'll put a little more. And then I'm going to drop in a little bit of the magenta in there. And it creates a nice amount of diversity in the shadow. And I'll pull out a little bit. This petal is coming out in this way. So I'll pull out some veins here on this one to just show that it's not a flat petal. It's got some shape to it. And I'm doing that with just taking a little bit of the paint on the edge, pulling it out with a damp brush. And then I'm going to deepen the shadow in the crevice here by just dropping in a little bit of paint and letting it mix in the wet paint that's already there and diffuse by itself, mixing with the underlying paint. And so you can see how that's beginning to have some shape to it. And of course it will dry much lighter, as always. And then we'll have to see if it needs any more final shaping. So I'll take a little bit of soft orange shadow here and add more to what I've already done underneath. Just a little bit. I don't want to cover up the shadow that I've already done underneath, which you can see the edge of here, that it has dried. But just make a new one that is smaller and inside that's a little more intense, and carry maybe some marks out. And on this one I can start to put a few of those little wrinkly marks in the shape of the petal. Now, there are different ways to approach this. Some people would approach it by putting more neutrals into these shadows rather than colorful shadows. I like the idea of sticking with the colors, and one can always bring in a little bit of neutrals at the end if you need to tone down. Another way to do it is also to do an undercoat of neutrals in the medium tone and glaze over with the colors. So there's a variety of ways of approaching this. I'm just doing a little more shaping now that it's drying and spreading. Just want a little diversity in that with the magenta color. There. So this process was still continuing. It's a slow process, so I won't bore you with every single petal. Here now, this has been drying, so I'll just do one more little tiny bit here. Again, much smaller than the ones that I put above, and I will just let that one gradually build into, and soften the edge there, build into the one that was already put in. It's a smaller one, it's more internal. It goes around that petal below. I don't want to lose the definition of that petal below. To the side, rather, this one here. So you can see there was the soft color, the first one. There have been 2 layers, and then there was the one we just added. That has begun to dry, and I have now just added a bit more. And that will help define the little bit of wrinkle in the petal above it by negative painting. So this is the process that I follow. I'll continue that and we'll come back. Well, I've finished with the stage of going with various more intense rose colors, soft magenta colors, soft scarlet colors, a little bit of burnt orange colors, in order to intensify the shape and shadows of these roses, and put in some marks to indicate here and there the shape of the rose with, and I used, the entire time I used a brush that is a travel brush by Sabovdik, made by Escoda. It's just a perfect, it has a cover, so that for plein air people, you can put it in there and travel with it. And it has a very good point. It's a number 10, and it's his travel brush by, it's spelled, his name is spelled, let's see if I can find it here. It's S.B. Sabovdik. But anyway, he's a master painter from I think New Zealand or possibly Australia, one of those 2 countries. But he's amazing, and he's created this set of brushes. It keeps a very, very fine point. So I did this entire painting so far with just this one synthetic brush. I was able to do the very fine lines, for example, with just putting in some fine lines like this, for example, to shape the flower, and softening the edges of some of them, and putting in shadows like this with a little bit of scrumbling like this, layer upon layer. For example, here I'll just do a few more. I've basically finished these petals, but I just want to show you, it's a very light touch here and there, layering slightly different colors. Now this color is a more bright red, it's more of a scarlet, and I'm putting it over the combination of violets and rose colors that I had below. And so it can create a little bit of color diversity that makes the eye pop. So just putting a few more veins here and there with this brush. So this is how I have done this whole painting, putting in little bits of shadows like this, petal by petal, using slightly different colors of rose, orange, scarlet, in here, magenta, a little bit of violet, very, very little. This could use a little more over here, for example. By using the bright scarlet on top of that magenta, it livens it up a little bit. So I'll just create a little bit more movement in here by stretching out that shadow. So that's what has been done. A few little places where the flower has turned and has kind of a wrinkly edge. I've shown some of those, but not all of them. So now what I want to try to do, I don't know how successful that will be, I want to do just a little tiny bit of dry brush. The rose is a very smooth flower, so you don't want to overdo it in terms of texture. But I've created a color here that is primarily a mixture of a little bit of rose and a lot more scarlet. And I'm just taking my totally dry flat brush and I'm putting it in there, and I'm just at an angle creating a little bit of feathery dry brush. It's very, very subtle. I think you can see a little bit of it. But I don't want this rose to look too perfect and flat, as if it's made out of plastic or ceramic. And one of the ways I can do that is to go over some of these with a little bit of dry brush. That creates a slight amount of texture and diversity on the petal. You can see how subtle it is. It's not a lot, but that's on that rose there. I'm going to take some of it on this big petal over here, and I'm going to try to go in a little closer for you to just see that one petal. Now this is a very key petal because it's right in the front. It's a huge petal. So I'm just going to go over it a little bit with this bright. I'm going to have to add a little more water to that, but I have to do that carefully because I don't want a wet brush. And I'm going to dry it a little bit on my paper towel. There. I'm just going to create a little bit of texture in that flower. And I'm using the scarlet for it because it's a nice bright red. Let me see this one here. I think now I'll go over to this next petal here. Yeah. And this again is a very large petal. I don't want to lose how light the petal is, but I just want to give this a little bit of texture. So I'm going to go around, and some places if I mark the mark too much, but I'm just using my flat brush and this vibrant red to go around here and give the impression, because the rose itself has veins and markings that are different from here to there. But up here, for example, I'll show you. I have to move the camera. I'll add a little more color in there. I have to add a little more of that bright color to my palette, because when I work on this, I'm using a large flat brush, so I want to go to my mixing tray and add that bright red to the mixing tray. And I'm going to add to it a small amount of rose madder. So it's scarlet and rose madder to just darken it up a little bit. So I have pretty much that consistency. I'm not making a thin wash. I want it thick enough. So I'm going to add that color now. These petals in the background are not very much defined. So I'm taking the flat, I'm putting it in the paint, I'm making sure it's not too wet, and then I'm putting dry brush a little bit here and there. In the directions that the petals are growing and opening. So it gives a kind of directional sense as well as a little bit of texture, because the veins will move out in the direction that the flower is opening. And this is just, it's not the same as when I drew in the marks. And then I just, every now and then, in some big area like this, where I have a big color, but it's kind of a big blob of a color, I'm also just dabbing and scrumbling a little bit with that brush that has a little bit of paint on it. And then the bristles, you can see they separate as you work. And then you can pop in some like dots of color made with the separated brush. This brush is a Quinacridone sable brush. Its size has worn off, so I don't know, but it's about 1 inch. It's a good size for this. So this is just to all this definition has happened in this flower, and it's too defined, it's too flat, it's too smooth. Life isn't perfect like that. So I'm just doing this here and there to bring in some texture and diversity in the paint. Put a little more, I'll show you in this one here, a little more in here. It's just now, I'm just bringing in some texture here and there, so it's not so perfect. And I had used quite a bit of dry brush on the horse that I just painted, and but that is for the purpose of making it also look like there's hair, as well as adding texture. But dry brush can be very helpful, and even on a smooth flower like the rose, I think that you can see that. I'm going to go out now, that it gives it, especially if you use a different color, and this is a very bright red, brighter than the others, the softer colors that are here, and it's more intense. So I'm putting it in some of the, just here and there. I don't want this to be too perfect looking. I want there to be some lost edges and some texture and a little more messy. So I think this rose is basically, these 2 roses are basically done. And the next thing we'll do is the bud. And the bud is on the side. I'll show you I think you'll be able to see the bud if I zero in and move the camera. There is a bud. That will be a green bud. And then there'll be a very, very loose washes. So we'll do the bud, And we'll also do the small leaves that frame this larger opening bud. And then there'll be all kinds of sort of abstract greens and blues and yellows in the background to indicate that these roses are in a garden. So we'll let this dry and come back for doing the bud in the background. Okay, green is a bit of a tricky color to use in a painting. It's, you want it to not be too bright. And so many times artists will mix their own greens. I'm going to take a basic let's see, I think that's an olive green, this one here. And when I look at the roses, they're a little more bright. I'll put a little hooker's green in it. And I'm going to take a little bit of gamboge, which is a yellow. And I'm going to put some of that. It's a bit too bright. So I'm going to have a bit of the green that is on the bright side for the area, some of the areas in the sun. And then I'm going to take, and that's mixed with the gamboge, but it could be any warm yellow. Could also be a yellow ochre. And on the side that is less in the sun, I'm going to bring in some cobalt blue and mix the green with the cobalt blue. So there will be this transition in the green from the lighter green, the warmer green, to the more bluish green. And then there's always some shadow green, so I'll bring a little bit of violet in here and mix that with that bluish green here. So I'm going to have these colors to very quickly deal with. So in the sunshine side, I'm going to use my first wash anyway is going to be this warm green that has some yellow in it. So on the side of these petals, that is like that. And then I'm going to transition to the green that was just the normal green, mixed of hooker green and olive green, but just a basic green. I'm going to take some of that and have that be in the next transition color away from the light. So you would see that as perhaps more of like an emerald green. And then I'm going to move into the shadow. And I'm letting these colors run together. So rather than glazing in this particular case, I could have done the petals this way too, but one has to work faster and more with more skill. But I'm using going into the violet green. So here I've done by working fast without glazing. I've got the first two petals. And we're going to do exactly the same thing over here. But this petal over here is really in the shade already. So I'm just going to use the bluish green color and paint that in with a little bit of the violet green. When I say violet green, it's just some violet mixed in with that green mixture. I'll put a little more violet green over here in the shadow and where the tip of the petal comes out. And here in the crevice between the two. And these are going to be much lighter, and we have to come back in and make more definition after they dry. So we're going to do the same thing with the bud. The bud has a section that is very much in the light. So I am doing that very brightly. And then each section is a little bit curved, has a little bit of a curve to it. So I'm going to do the next two sections on one side. Then I'm going to take the blue, the bluish green. I'm going to intensify that a little bit. And put it into give the shape, because you could see that the bud has like sections that have shapes to them. And I'm letting the colors mix by themselves. And I'll go to the blue. This last section I'm just going to do entirely in the bluish green. And this was decided just by looking at the colors, and so I'll bring some more violet into that green. And so I'm going to then bring in the violet in the shadows on some of these sections. And that's how I'm going to start that bud and leave it to dry. Give a little bit of the light green here on the points. And then there's a leaf that's mostly in shadow, but not completely. So I'll put some of it with the blue-green, where it would be in shadow from the bud. And drop in a little bit of the violet green, again, where it's in shadow by the bud. And then for the stem, I'm going to go down the stem with the warm yellow-green on the light side, on the side where there's light. And I'm going to go down the stem on the other side with the blue-green, and they automatically mix together. And as I said, we could have done each petal this way too, with different colors of rose, letting them blend together. There were so many of the petals that I wanted some diversity in how I treated them. So I'm just going to do this very lightly here. We're going to do the background of the, got to hold my palm up. I just put my palm in one of these leaves here. So I have to fix that. Okay, good. So I'm just going to leave that and paint around it to do the background, and then come in and detail it more after doing the background, so that it doesn't have a lot of definition when doing the background that might bleed into the background and make a mess. But this anyway shows the basic structure of these two shapes, and it's pretty straightforward. Again, using the mixing tray of, there's a bluish green, a yellowish green, and a violet green to do that. Okay, the next step after that is dry is the background. See you in a little bit. Hi. I like to study my painting a little bit after it dries, and sometimes I do backgrounds in advance of the basic painting. Other times, it depends. Every painting is different, and so there is no set way of how to proceed. But what I think with this one, I've been looking at it, and it has a lot of smooth texture. It needs a certain amount of diversity in the background to make it interesting, to make it feel like a garden. But doing a lot of leaves and being precise about a garden would be unnecessary and a bit distracting. So what I want to do is follow up with the blues in the picture and the bluish greens in the picture for the background. I don't really want to put any yellows in the background. So I think what I'm going to do is take a basic green. I've got so many greens on my palette. My way of working is to put my blues and greens on one palette and my reds and violets on another and my yellows and earth colors on another. So I have to decide. I'm kind of going around the palette. Yeah, that hooker green is a pretty good green for me to start with. So I'm going to use that, and then I'm going to use this manganese blue because it's granulating and I want texture. And I'm also going to use this ultramarine blue also because it granulates. So the first thing I'll do is spray water into the wells of these colors so that I can make a nice mixture of them. So here's my ultramarine blue. Here's the hooker green. It's a nice earthy forest green. It's not too olive, and it's not too bright and apple green colored. It's a nice mixture. And here's my manganese blue, which is it tends a little bit toward a teal color, but unlike the cobalt teal, it granulates. So I'm going to mix these, and I'm getting the kind of bluish green that I'm wanting. I'm going to add some more of the manganese blue because down in the bottom part, I'm going to just work right now in the top part of the painting, because down in the bottom part of the painting I'll put in a lot more ultramarine blue. I'll use the same basic mixture but put in more ultramarine blue. I'll just indicate how that would look if I were to do that, and that would give me a darker blue. But for what I'm going to do here in the top of the painting, I'm going to focus on the manganese blue being strong in this color, and there are lots of ways that I can create texture and diversity in the painting. And one way is to use some kind of cling wrap. This is actually a roll of cling wrap that I got in Zambia when I was on assignment there 2 years ago. So it's not a local brand, but we have saran wrap and various kinds of cling wrap in the supermarkets. And I'm not going to put that cling wrap everywhere, but I'm going to make enough. So I'm just going to put down, my brush has got some color on it. That's okay. So but I'm just putting water on, and because the brush has some color, you're seeing some color, which helps also that you can see where the water is. So I'm basically putting water in this top part of the painting. I shouldn't have put it too close to that rose because it's bleeding a little bit now. And so I just want to stay away from the rose a bit. So anywhere where it might be bleeding, I'm going to just dab with my paper towel so that doesn't happen. And where yeah. So now I'm going to drop in that color in various places. It's a wonderful bluish green. And I just want some dark areas and some lighter areas. I'm not going to try to fill the space because all I'm going to do right now is focus on creating texture in the top portion of the painting. I'll put a little here. I'll put a little here because I'll come in later and fill in the spaces. But I'm just going to take some cling wrap, section by section, and I'm going to put it on the paper and move it around a little bit till I have more or less the shapes that I want. And take some more. Now this is going to take a little while to dry, so I'm doing this early in the process, and then I'll go down and work on the bottom section just using a brush. But I'll leave this top section to dry while I'm working on the bottom section. Okay, and then I'll come in and make sure you don't get any of this on the rose. I want to make sure that I keep it away from the rose because otherwise it'll make marks on the rose petals. I gotta move it away from the rose petal. Yeah, so whatever I have to do to keep it away from the rose petal. Okay, and the rose petals so that they're kept safe. The pod is less, the seed pod is less important. This bud that hasn't opened is less important because it's green, but still I want to keep it away from that as well. So I have to be careful about that because it will make marks everywhere there. So that will just stay alone until it's completely dry. And then we can focus on the bottom part of the painting. And so I'm going to bring in more of that ultramarine as I said I would. And I'm just going to start, I think you can see the bottom here. Yes, you can. I'm just going to start painting around with, I'm going to use a flat brush because it has good coverage, like as you can see. And I can fill the space pretty quickly with that flat brush in this way. But then I'll come in while it's still wet in this area. I'll come in with the other brush that I showed you I was using. I'll come in with this smaller brush here. That is a Escoda Versatile synthetic. Very nice line of brushes. Keeps a point and has lots of bounce. Holds the water well. Of course, the sable holds the water more than any brush, it seems, any of the other hairs, but every year there's less and less of that animal available and less of that hair available. And those brushes are already very expensive, but they're going to get more so, more expensive as time goes by. And, you know, if we can find an alternative, it's good. This synthetic wand brush is very, very nice. But there are times when you want to have a brush that is made of hair and can hold a lot of water. The squirrel holds a lot of water, but it bends a lot. It doesn't have the firmness like this synthetic brush does. The goat hair is actually has a lot more stiffness, so that's a good alternative. Some of the brushes are made of a mixture of goat hair and synthetic, so you get the good. I have to get that paint out of that petal. Make sure that I clean it with water. Get it out of that petal there. Okay. All right. So there's a part of the bottom. Do some more over here. I don't have as much space for the big brush over here, so I'll just use this little one. And just carefully go around. I'm only just being careful not to get it into the rose. So I'm staying just outside the edge of the rose. And this is just the first color, because what I'm going to do, you see the nice granulation? I'm going to go in with the zoom in so you can see how wonderful this paint granulates. You see all the texture there? It's just incredible amount of granulation that I get from both the ultramarine blue and the manganese blue. So if I didn't have good granulation, I would probably come back in and do a lot of, see the granulation? And as it dries, you'll continue to see that texture of like grains of paint. So these two colors, manganese blue and ultramarine blue, are rated for being good granulators. Yeah. So let me put the camera back. Sorry, I have to move it around like that. Yeah, okay. Just trying to get it so it doesn't fall over. Well, that's a little bit, yeah. I have to lean it on the table so that it doesn't fall over. Okay, there. All right, so that's a good color. I might want some diversity with a little bit of, I'm going to take a little bit of Cascade green and drop some of that in to have some darkness. It's very intense dark green. And I'll take some, because I don't have a blue that is darker than the ultramarine blue. That's the darkest blue. But I want to have this a little darker down here. And the Cascade green has some granulating properties too. So I'm mixing a little bit of that ultramarine, dropping in more plain ultramarine and some Cascade Then I can also drop in, remember we have a Payne's Gray that is got a blue hue. I'll drop in a little bit of that as well. Payne's Gray is like a black mixed with blue. So one can make it if you don't have it on your palette. You can make a mixture of black with ultramarine blue or phthalo blue and get something similar to this Payne's Gray. But I just want to make it very, very, very dark, but have that rich base that I put on, creating color and texture, because that will continue to do that. But having some of the depth in some areas and diversity in some areas of the background. So you see the background can be done pretty quickly, and that cling rack is working on its own to make the interesting texture up above. I could also put some cling wrap down here. I'm not sure I want to do that. I might put a tiny little section in just to have some continuity with the top. So I'm taking a small piece. Let me put some dark colors in here because the cling wrap will pick up some of the color and hold it itself. Put some of that mixture in here. And I'm just going to put a little bit of this cling wrap in a few places. Small amount. Just lay it down. So this is something that takes a while to dry once you've put this down. You can't really use the hair dryer to speed it up. You just have to be patient and let it fully dry. And it'll create some beautiful texture. I'm going to put a little bit down here too. There. And I'll paint around a few other places. And then I'll have to leave this to dry. But basically, this will be the ending of the painting, because once you have, once this is completely dry and you pick up your cling wrap, then you'll just use your brush to kind of paint around the flowers, like I'm doing now in some places. Paint around the flowers and yeah, I better not try to go in here too much. Let's see if I can do a little bit. It seems like it's making that, in some areas it's making that pattern very quickly. It's almost dry in some areas. I can show you right here. Okay, I'll just pick up that one and paint around the bud. And once that pattern it's still not completely dry, but it gives you an idea, and it's okay that this pattern is going to diffuse a little bit because I took it won't be as sharply defined because it's still wet, and so it won't, but what I'll do is just paint around it in some places and blend it in some places like I'm doing here. You see? So there's some pattern, but I'm not just going to leave that pattern, you know? So here's another area I can lift up a little bit and work on defining the bud, but I'm going to have to leave the rest of it because I'm pushing the envelope by trying to do some things. And I'm staying with this wonderful bluish green for the background that we mixed with the manganese blue and the ultramarine blue together with the hooker's green. And just filling in the spaces. Reminds me of when I used to color in the coloring books as a kid. I loved coloring in coloring books. It was so relaxing. I'm glad that there's still, that now some people are doing adult coloring books because it's just a wonderful process. And if anybody's having any issues from a fall or Lyme disease, having some brain fog from that, the coloring in a coloring book is a wonderful thing for them to try to do. It'll help them to heal I have friends that have been successful at getting past some of their brain fog issues from Lyme disease by coloring. So if you have a friend that's suffering from that, you might think about getting them some adult coloring books. When I had a traumatic brain injury from falling down 13 steps, hitting my head on every step, I just painted abstracts the whole year. I couldn't paint anything else. And then one other year when I got sepsis, again I got brain fog again. And for the whole year I just painted abstracts. Just watched the paint flow on the paper and relaxed and painted, but not able to paint anything realistic during that time. So, if you have a friend that needs some, So pretty much this is how I'm going to do the background. Just painting around. Some of the texture created. Unfortunately, I took that stuff off too soon and it's bled a bit. But anyway, it's okay because it's okay if it's not as well defined as some other areas because I got some of the background paint on the rose from the cling wrap. Not good. But it's early enough that I can. Yeah, I'll have to do a little bit of repair on that, but it's not too bad. Getting a really dark color like the Cascade Green on the rose is not exactly a great idea. Okay, so I'll just do a little bit of negative painting around the rose with the background in some areas, blending it, making some areas a little darker than others. And this is a process that I will continue after all of that cling wrap stuff is dry. I'll come back one more time and show you how to finish up. Hope you're enjoying this process. Thanks. Well, I just took away the cling wrap, and we have some very nice patterns here. And I think that it's going to be easy to take this to the final step. Now, the issue about having this patterning go on in the painting is that you really can't go over the patterns and glaze it, because it will just reconstitute the paint and you will lose the pattern. So the best we can do in working on this at this point is to go around the pattern wherever we want a little more depth of color, or we'll glaze over the pattern if we don't want the pattern in that place. But we can't go over the pattern with paint, because otherwise it will just make the paint wet and we'll lose the pattern. So we've got to basically decide where we want to keep the pattern, where we want to go around it in some places, or soften some edges. I want to recapture the bud that is over here and accentuate that with some darks around that stem and the little leaves of the bud. So I'm just going to do, but I'm going to honor the pattern as well. You can see I'm going to go around some of it. In some places I might even create some additional pattern right here, going between two marks of the pattern and creating something that complements the pattern with a dark, in this case, some Payne's gray and some of the blue-green mixed together. And so I'll keep that line of the pattern. And I want to get back and honor the bud. I have to make sure I don't put my hand on top of wet paint. So the rim of the bud is here, so I'm putting some darks around it, doing what's called, as you know, negative painting around the bud. And that negative painting means to paint around something to accentuate it, and but not painting on the item, but negative painting around it. So I'm doing a little negative painting here and there, and that's primarily what we're going to do, unless there's some places. So there I'm going to cut into the pattern a little bit, and again kind of make some pattern that complements the pattern. Because eventually what we want is something that where the pattern is still there, but we have made it fit into the context of the painting. So I'm just going around that bud. You might remember what the drawing looked like. And there's the leaf on the bud, if you remember. And with a little lighter color, I'm making a different lighter triangle, but darker than the pattern, so that basically I'm getting this to harmonize into the pattern in some way. I think you can see what I'm trying to do in terms of working my way into the pattern, but not ruining it, hopefully. We can always glaze over it. I'm hoping not to have to do that. I'm just dropping some darker color, again, to create some variation in this background, so that it could be potentially looking a bit like there's a lot of activity in leaves and stems and things in this area, but not actually trying to draw any of those things. So I'm taking some lighter blues and green here. I'm going to just do a little bit of mixture. I don't want to really ruin that pattern there, but I have to get some negative painting around the rose. I have to lift some color out of here. So it's the bud. So I'm going to do so with a wet brush, wiped clean. I'm going to do a little bit of blending in here. And hopefully that will maintain the pattern, but show some continuity. I don't need it to be too dark up here, but so it's a little lighter, but I've mixed some of that Payne's Gray in with the green mixture, but not making it as dark as I did over here. I have to correct some paint that got on top of the rose here. Very happy with how the pattern came out. It's, you know, one never knows when you just decide to let the paint do what it wants to do, and with a little bit of technique here and there, and sometimes the cling wrapping can produce some wonderful things, and I really like it for backgrounds. I chose to do the paint used in the cling wrap a bit dark. Of course, there's, if you do it with very light paints, then it can be a very subtle pattern, but it's always very interesting. I have to fix this edge here, where some paint is getting on the edge. There. I'd like a little more intensity over here, under this, and in this little crevice here of the flower. Just like a little more intensity there. Because actually, you know, behind the bud, from the way the light comes, it should be in shadow there. And the same thing over here. The big bud here versus the small bud can be casting quite a big shadow in this area. I'm making some marks that would be like stems And I can do some lifting with a clean, damp brush. Lifting. Like, it's another way of making a pattern. Just clean your brush and lift paint out. Lift paint out. Lift paint out. Creates that impression that maybe there's some kind of vegetation there. Oh, dear, dear, dear. I don't want that. Okay. I do want to make this edge a little more defined. It's gotten messed up a bit. Yeah, I think that's a little better. Now I come in, take a little more edge out, lift a little more. Yeah, I like the way that lifting is working. That's another way, but it's a good complement to the pattern created by the cling wrap. And I'm using that same mix of blues and greens that we used to create the cling wrap pattern. So that here and there, I'm just adding some color, and yet trying to leave the pattern and not wash over it. In a few places, I'm interrupting the pattern because I don't want it to be too precise. So I might, like here, just make some marks around it so it's softening some edges, blending it in here and there. I mean, the idea is to have it be subtle. So in some places, like here, just losing the edges, losing some edges, and leaving some others. See? So whatever you get from your cling wrap, you're just going to have to dance with it, as if you're doing a little cha-cha-cha. Yeah. I've got to soften that edge there. It's making a little mess by itself. Sometimes it does that. It's too much water in the mix, and then it blends out. So let's see, where else we need a little bit of playing. I think this is looking like a sunburst here. We don't really want that. So I'll just put some color to blend the pattern in that place a little bit. And sometimes a little different color, a little of the manganese blue just by itself. And other times where we've mixed the manganese blue and the green with the ultramarine, just in some places the mixture, in some places one of the three colors by itself. But I would stick to those three colors for this work in the background here. The only place that I've added something is a little Payne's gray in this area here, where I needed it to be darkest. What's happening in this spot here is this complex array of very dark color, and also the color contrast of the red against the blue and green, coupled with the light of that bud, is making this whole area here clearly a focal point for the painting, which is good. So I'm just making sure that the darks versus the lights are strong here to get that value contrast that will bring the eye into this area as the focal point. But try to do it so that it's not obvious. Maybe it is obvious, I don't know, I can't tell at this point. I'll know when it dries. But what I like, this to me is with the glow of this light color and the red and the extreme dark is where I want my focal point. I could have made it here, but these are more or less all in medium values. So it isn't until you really have a very dark value against a very light one that you create your focal point. And when you can have then also the color contrast in that same area, that just further, I need to carry some of this dark so that it just extends the area of the focal point a little bit to embrace a little more area, but this is part of it. I'll just blend some of this out. Manganese blue, but with more paint, not thinned out. And as I remember, that has a lot of texture of its own. So when put next to the other things where the texture is created by the cling wrap, works very nicely. I don't have a plan for this. I'm just following the lead of the watercolor and going where I think it wants me to go relative to leaving some of the areas light that it has created and making some of them a bit darker or a bit more colorful. It's a very organic process. Normally I would be able to see a little bit better, but because the camera has to be where I want to be, I'm off to the side a little bit, which makes it a little hard to be able to tell whether this is starting to look the way I want it to look. But so sometimes I have to stop and wait and move the camera away and look at it without the camera in the way. Yeah, I think that's moving along pretty nicely. I think I want to have a little more of that wonderful intensity of color down here. So I'm just going to drop some in, but not take away that beautiful pattern that's there. Try to honor the fact that that's there, but not destroy it. And take a little bit up here. Do the same thing. Again, I don't want too much of that, but I do think I like the intensity of this color here and there. There's almost like a little magical place down here where the fairies would be. There's something very special about it. It has this nice quality. I think you're beginning to see the value contrast and how we make some lost edges. I've got too much of an edge there. So I'll put a little water and blend some color in there. It's okay here and there to lose some of the pattern. Or soften. Sometimes we don't totally lose the pattern when we put paint on top of it, but we soften it so you can't see it quite as clearly, but it's still somewhat there. Yeah, I think this is coming together pretty nicely. I think, for the next phase of this, I'm going to put some of this color on my plate and do a little dry brush to blend in rather than any more wet, because I really don't want to lose the pattern. So I'll put a little dry brush with a little bit of green and manganese blue. Keep it in the middle tone area and just use the wet. So I'm taking a little bigger Kolinsky sable, and I'm just going to, as I showed you before with the roses, just putting the tips in the color. And I'm going to blend in some of these edges near the top of the paper. So that we don't have pattern running off the paper, but we can still see it. I think you're getting a sense of how that dry brush is working. And the nice thing about it is that and we call it dry brush, but basically the brush is damp, and the tips of the brush have color on them. So it's not making the pattern below all reconstituted and not making it wash away. But I'm putting some, I can put some texture. Sometimes what we use is some splatter from the just put some splatter on it. You can use an airbrush or a toothbrush, or just take a wet paintbrush and splatter. But I'm just doing a bit here and there where I want to change the contrast and soften it a little bit. So the pattern's still evident. I think you can see that. So it gives you an idea that there's something happening here, and this could be a garden. See how the brush begins to separate from being used in this way, and that gives you also some more interesting shapes and marks. Got to be careful not to overdo this. Okay, I think that's enough of a demonstration for now. Except that I think I will actually make a puddle of the manganese blue mixed with the ultramarine blue and use my toothbrush to splatter in that area, because I think that would be the finishing touch that would get me to the point where I want to be. So let me get a piece of paper to cover up the okay, I'm going to cover up the rose, and I'm going to put my toothbrush in the color. Hopefully I've got enough color on there, and make some marks. Yeah. Needs to be a little wetter. So I'll just put my toothbrush, and this is a nice medium tone, so it's not creating a lot of very dark speckles, but it's creating a nice amount. Okay, I'll cover this here. Yep, got some there. I think I'll get some over here. Okay. That one area is a little too dark and defined. I'm just blending a little bit. That brush is too soft for that work. Let me, there, just taking out some of that color out. It's too much. So I'm lifting. Lifting. Blending. Okay. Okay, I better stop before I make a big mess. The hardest part in painting with watercolor is knowing when to stop. And I think I have perhaps gone a little too far, but we'll see it better if I clean this. Then you'll see how it looks. And it's, oops, there's a little speck, which we don't want there. Okay. So there we have it. Let me see if we can get a better sense sometimes you have to use your finger to blend. And this is one of those moments. So I'll just go in a little bit with the zoom. You can see some of the pattern. some of the texture. That gives you some idea. I hope you enjoyed the process. Thank you for joining me.